Hello. I decided, since I was reading a book for the last couple weeks, I want to give Terry Pratchett, The Color of Magic a try. Since I was just talking about it, and it was pretty fantastic. And I was remembering a couple things. So here we go. The Color of Magic, a Discworld novel by Terry Pratchett. If I had a penny for every time someone asked me where I got the idea of Discworld, I'd have, hang on a moment, £4.67. Anyway, the answer is that it was lying around and didn't look as if it belonged to anyone. The world rides through space on the back of a turtle. It is one of the great ancient myths found wherever men and turtles were gathered together. The 4 elephants were an Indo-European sophistication. The idea has been lying in the lumber rooms of legends for centuries. All I had to do was grab it and run away before the alarms went off. Since this is a reprint by popular demand, of the first book in a series that will eventually contain at least 10, there's a very good chance that you already know what happens after this book, which is more than I did when I wrote it. The Discworld is not a coherent fantasy world. Its geographic is fuzzy. Its chronology unreliable. A small traveling circle of firelight in a chilly infinity has turned out to be the home of the most defiant jokes and last chances. There are no maps. You can't map a sense of humor. Anyway, what is a fantasy map but a space beyond there be dragons? On a Discworld, we know that there be dragons everywhere. They might not all have scales and forked tongues, but they be here all right, grinning and jostling and trying to sell you souvenirs. Enjoy. Terry Pratchett, October 1989. The Color of Magic. Prologue. In a distant and second-hand set of dimensions, in an astral plane that was never meant to fly, the curling star mists waver and part. See. Great Atuin, the turtle, comes, swimming slowly through the interstellar gulf, hydrogen frost on his ponderous limbs, his huge and ancient shell pocked with meteor craters. Through sea-sized eyes that are crusted with rheum and asteroid dust, he stares fixedly at the destination. In a brain bigger than a city with geological slowness, he thinks only of the weight. Most of the weight is, of course, accounted for by Beryllia, Tubal, Great Pthong, and Jarakeen, the 4 giant elephants, upon whose broad shoulders and star-tanned shoulders the disk of the world rests, garlanded by the long waterfall at his vast circumference and domed by the baby blue vault of heaven. Astropsychology has been, as yet, unable to establish what they think about. The Great Turtle was a mere hypothesis until the day the small and secretive kingdom of Cruel, whose rimmost mountains project out over the rimfall, built a gantry and pulley arrangement at the tip of the most precipitous crag, and lowered several observers over the edge in a quartz-windowed brass vessel to peer through the mist's veils. The early astrozoologists, hauled back from their long dangle by enormous teams of slaves, were able to bring back much information about the shape and nature of Atuin and the elephants, but this did not resolve the fundamental questions about the nature and purpose of the universe. For example, what was Atuin's actual sex? This vital question, said the astrozoologist with mounting authority, would not be answered until a larger and more powerful gantry was constructed for a deep space vessel. In the meantime, they could only speculate about the revealed cosmos. There was, for example, the theory that Atuin had come from nowhere and could continue at a uniform crawl, or steady gait into nowhere for all time. This theory was popular, rather. An alternative, favored by those of the religious persuasion, was that Atuin was crawling from the birthplace to the time of mating, as were all the stars in the sky, which were obviously also carried by giant turtles. When they arrived, they would briefly and passionately mate for the first and only time, and from that fiery union new turtles would be born to carry new pattern of worlds. This was known as the Big Bang hypothesis. Thus it was that a great cosmocolonian of the Steady Gate faction, testing a new telescope with which he hoped to make measurements of the precise albedo of great Atuin's right eye, was on this eventful evening the first outsider to see the smoke rise hubward from the burning of the oldest city in the world. Later that night, he became so engrossed in his studies that he completely forgot about it. Nevertheless, he was the first. There were others. Chapter 1. Fire roared through the bifurcated city of Ankh-Morpork, where it licked the wizard's quarter. It burned blue and green, and was even laced with strange sparks of the eighth color octarine, where its outriders found their way into the vast vats and oil stores along the merchant street. It progressed a series of blazing fountains and explosions. In the streets of the perfume blenders, it burned with a sweetness. Where it touched the bundles of rare and dry herbs in the storerooms of the drug masters, it made men go mad and talk to God. By now, the whole of downtown Morpork was alight, and the richer and worthier citizens of Ankh on the far bank were bravely responding to the situation by feverishly demolishing the bridges. But already the ships in the Morpork docks, laden with grain, cotton, and timber, and coated with tar, were blazing merrily, and their moorings, burnt to ashes, were breasting the river Ankh on the ebb tide, igniting riverside palaces and bowers as they drifted like drowning fireflies toward the sea. In any case, sparks were riding the breeze and touching down far across the river in hidden gardens and remote rickyards. The smoke from the merry burning rose miles high in a wind-sculpted black column that could be seen across the whole of the Discworld. It was certainly impressive from the cool, dark hilltop a few leagues away, where two figures were watching with considerable interest. The taller of the pair was chewing on a chicken leg and leaning on a sword that was only marginally shorter than the average man. If it wasn't for the air of wary intelligence about him, it might have been supposed that he was a barbarian from the Hudland wastes. His partner was much shorter and wrapped from head to toe in a brown cloak. Later, when he has occasion to move, it will be seen that he moves lightly, cat-like. The two had barely exchanged a word in the last 20 minutes, except for a short and inconclusive argument as to whether a particularly powerful explosion had been the oil bond store or the workshop of Caribou the Enchanter. Money hinged on the fact. Now the big man finished gnawing at the bone and tossed it into the grass, smiling ruefully. "There go all those little alleyways," he said. "I liked them." "All the treasured houses," said the small man. He added thoughtfully, "Do gems burn? I wonder. 'Tis said they're akin to coal." "All the coal, all the gold melting and running down the gutters," said the big one, ignoring him. "All the wine, boiling in the barrels." "There were rats," said his brown companion. "Rats, I'll grant you." "It was no place to be in high summer." "That too. One can't help feeling, though, a momentary—" He trailed off. Then brightened. "We owe Fredera at Crimson Leech 8 silver pieces," he added. The little man nodded. They were silent for a while, as a whole new series of explosions carved a red line across a hitherto dark section of the greatest city in the world. Then the big man stirred. "Weasel?" "Yes." "I wonder who started it." The small swordsman, known as Weasel, said nothing. He was watching the road in a ruddy light. Few had come that way since the Deosil Gate had been one of the first to collapse in a shower of white-hot embers. But two were now coming up it now. The Weasel's eyes, always at their sharpest in gloom and half-light, made out the shapes of two mounted men and some sort of low beast behind them. Doubtless, a rich merchant escaping with as much treasure as he could lay his frantic hands on. The Weasel said as much to his companion, who sighed. "The status of footpad ill suits us," said the barbarian. "But as you say, times are hard, and there are no soft beds tonight." He shifted his grip on his sword, and as the leading rider drew near, stepped out onto the road with a hand held up, and his face set in a grin nicely calculated to reassure yet threaten. "Your pardon, sir," he began. The rider reined in his horse and drew back his hood. The big man looked into a face blotched with superficial burns and punctuated by tufts of singed beard. Even the eyebrows had gone. "Bugger off," said the face. "You're brav to Hublander." The shape and cosmology of the disk system are perhaps worthy of note at this point. There are, of course, two major directions on the disk, hubward and rimward. But since its Since the disk itself revolves at a rate of once every 800 days in order to distribute the weight fairly upon its supportive pachyderms, according to the Reforge of Cruel, there are also two lesser directions, which are turnwise and widdershins. Since the disk's tiny orbiting sunlet maintains a fixed orbit while the majestic disk turns slowly beneath it, it will be readily deduced that a disk year consists of not 4, but 8 seasons. The summers are those times when the sun rises or sets at the nearest point on the rim. The winters are those occasions when it rises or sets at a point around 90 degrees along the circumference. Thus, in the lands around the Circle C, the year begins on Hog's Watch Night, progresses through a spring rime to its first midsummer, Small God's Eve, which is followed by Autumn Prime, and, straddling the half-year point of Crueltide, Winter Secundus, also known as Spindle Winter, since at this time the sun rises in the direction of Spin. Then comes Secundus Spring with Summer 2 on its heels. The 3-quarter mark of the year being the night of All's Fallow, the one night of the year, according to legend, when witches and warlocks stay in bed. Then drifting leaves and frosty nights drag on toward Black Spindle Winter, and a new Hog's Watch Night nestling like a frozen jewel at its heart. Since the hub is never closely warmed by the weak sun, the lands there are locked in permafrost. The rim, on the other hand, is a region of sunny islands and balmy days. There are, of course, 8 days in a disk week and 8 colors in its light spectrum. 8 is a number of some considerable occult significance on the disk and must never ever be spoken by a wizard. Precisely why all the above should be so is not clear, but go some way to explain why on the disk the gods are not so much worshipped as blamed. Aren't you? Bravd became aware that he had fumbled the initiative. "Just go away, will you?" said the rider. "I haven't got time for you, do you understand?" He looked around and added, "That goes for your shadow-loving flea-bag partner, wherever he's hiding." The weasel stepped up to the horse and peered at the disheveled figure. "Why, it's Rincewind the wizard, isn't it?" he said in tones of delight, meanwhile flinging the wizard's description of him in his memory for leisurely vengeance. "I thought I recognized the voice." Bravd spat and sheathed his sword. It was seldom worth tangling with wizards. They so rarely had any treasure worth speaking of. "He talks pretty big for a gutter wizard," he muttered. "You don't understand at all," said the wizard wearily. "I'm so scared of you my spine has turned to jelly. It's just that I'm suffering from an overdose of terror right now. I mean, when I've got to go over that, then I'll have time to be decently frightened of you." The weasel pointed toward the burning city. "You've been through that?" he asked. The wizard rubbed a red, raw hand across his eyes. "I was back there when it started. See him, back there?" He pointed back down the road where his traveling companion was still approaching, having adopted a method of riding that involved falling out of the saddle every few seconds. "Well?" said the weasel. "He started it," said Rincewind simply. Bravd and Weasel looked at the figure, now hopping across the road with one foot in a stirrup. "Fire Raiser, is he?" said Bravd at last. "No," said Rincewind, "not precisely. Let's just say that if complete and utter chaos were lightning, then he'd be the sort to stand on a hilltop in a thunderstorm wearing wet copper armor and shouting, 'All gods are bastards. Got any food?'" "There's some chicken," said Weasel, "in exchange for a story." "What's his name?" said Bravd, who tended to lag behind in conversations. "Two-Flower." "Two-Flower?" said Bravd. "What a funny name." "You," said Rincewind, dismounting, "do not know the half of it. Chicken, you say?" "Deviled," said Weasel. The wizard groaned. "That reminds me," added the weasel, snapping his fingers. "There was really a big explosion, about half an hour ago." "That was the oil bond store going up," said Rincewind, wincing at the memory of the burning rain. Weasel turned and grinned expectantly at his companion, who grunted and handed over a coin from his pouch. Then there was a scream from the roadway, cut off abruptly. Rincewind did not look up from his chicken. One of the things he can't do, he can't ride a horse," he said. Then he stiffened, as if sandbagged by a sudden recollection, gave a small yelp of terror, and dashed into the gloom. When he returned, the being called Two-Flower was hanging limply over his shoulder. It was small and skinny, and dressed very oddly in a pair of knee-length breeches and a shirt in such a violent and vivid conflict of colors that Weasel's fastidious eye was offended to even in the half-light. "No bones broken by the feel of things," said Rincewind. He was breathing heavily. Bravd winked at the Weasel, and went to investigate the shape they assumed was a pack animal. "You'd be wise to forget it," said the wizard, without looking up from his examination of the unconscious two-flower. "Believe me, a power protects it." "A spell?" said Weasel, squatting down. "No, but a magic of a kind, I think. Not the usual sort. I mean, it can turn to gold. It can turn gold into copper, while at the same time it is still gold. It makes men rich by destroying their possessions. It allows the weak to walk fearlessly among thieves. It passes through the strongest doors to leech the most protected treasures. Even now it has me enslaved, so that I must follow this madman willy-nilly and protect him from harm. It's stronger than you, Bravd. It is, I think, more cunning than you, Weasel." "What's it called, then, this mighty magic?" Rincewind shrugged. "In our tongue it's called reflected sound as of underground spirits. Is there any wine?" "You must know that I'm not without artifice where the magic is concerned," said Weasel. "Only last year did I, assisted by my friend there, part the notoriously powerful archmage of Yermituri from his staff, his belt of moon jewels, and his life in that approximate order. I do not fear this reflected sound of the underground spirits of which you speak. However," he added, "you engage my interest. Perhaps you would care to tell me more." Bravd looked at the shape on the road. It was closer now and clearer in the pre-dawn light. It looked for all the world like... "A pox on legs?" he asked. "I'll tell you about it," said Rincewind. "If there's any wine, that is." Down in the valley there was a roar and a hiss. Someone more thoughtful than the rest had ordered to be shut the big river gates that were at the point of where the Ankh flowed from the Twin Cities. Denied its usual egress, the river had burst its bank and was pouring down the fire-ravaged streets. Soon the continent of flame had become a series of islands, each one growing smaller as the dark tide rose, and up from the city of fumes and smoke rose a broiling cloud of steam covering the stars. Weasel thought it looked like some dark fungus or mushroom. The twin city of proud Ankh and the pestilent Morpork, of which all other cities of time and space are, as it were, mere reflections, has stood many assaults in its long and crowded history, and has always risen to flourish again. So the fire and its subsequent flood, which destroyed everything left that was not flammable and added a particularly noisome flux to the survivors' problems, did not mark its end. Rather it was a fiery punctuation mark, a coal-like comma, or salamander semicolon in a continuing story. Several days before these events, a ship came up the Ankh on the dawn tide and fetched up, among many others, in the maze of wharves and docks on the Morpork shore. It carried a cargo of pink pearls, milk nuts, pumice, and some official letters from the patrician of Ankh, and a man. It was the man who engaged the attention of Blind Hugh, one of the beggars on the early duty at Pearl Dock. He nudged Cripple Wah in the ribs and pointed wordlessly. Now the stranger was standing on the quayside, watching several straining seamen carry a large brass-bound chest down the gangplank. Another man, obviously the captain, was standing beside him. There was about the seaman every nerve in Blind Hugh's body which tended to vibrate in the presence of even a small amount of impure gold at 50 paces, screamed into his brain the air of one anticipating imminent enrichment. Sure enough, when the chest had been deposited on the cobbles, the stranger reached into a pouch, and there was a flash of a coin. Several coins, gold. Blind Hugh, his body twanging like a hazel rod in the presence of water, whistled to himself. Then he nudged Wah again and sent him scurrying off down the nearby alley into the heart of the city. When the captain walked back onto his ship, leaving the newcomer looking faintly bewildered on the quayside, Blind Hugh snatched up his begging cup and made his way across the street with an ingratiating leer. At the sight of him, the stranger started to fumble urgently with his money pouch. "Good day to thee, sire," Blind Hugh began, and found himself looking into a face with 4 eyes in it. He turned to run. "Said the stranger, and grabbed his arm. Hugh was aware that the sailors lining the rail of the ship were laughing at him. At the same time, his specialized senses detected an overpowering impression of money. He froze. The stranger let go and quickly thumbed in through a small black book that he had taken from his belt. Then he said, "Hello." "What?" said Hugh. The man looked blank. "Hello," he repeated, rather louder than necessary, and so carefully that Hugh could hear the vowels tinkling into place. "Hello yourself," Hugh reposted. The stranger smiled widely, fumbled yet again in the pouch. This time his hand came out holding a large gold coin. It was, in fact, slightly larger than an $8,000 Ankian crown, and the design on it was so unfamiliar, but it spoke inside Hugh's mind in such a language that he understood perfectly. "My current owner," it said, "is in need of succor and assistance. Why not give it to him so you and me can go off somewhere and enjoy ourselves?" Subtle changes in the beggar's posture made the stranger feel more at ease. He consulted the small book again. "I wish to be directed to a hotel, tavern, lodging house, inn, hospice, caravanserai," he said. "What, all of them?" said Hugh, taken aback. Said the stranger. Hugh was aware that a small crowd of fishwives, shellfish diggers, and freelance goppers were watching them with interest. "Look," he said, "I know a good tavern. Is that enough?" He shuddered to think about the gold coin escaping from his life. He'd keep that one if even Umor confiscated all the rest. And the big chest that comprised most of the newcomer's luggage looked to be full of gold, Hugh decided. The four-eyed man looked at his book. "I would like to be directed to a hotel, place of repose, tavern, a—" "Yes, all right, come on then," said Hugh hurriedly. He picked up one of the bundles and walked away quickly. The stranger, after a moment's hesitation, strolled after him. A train of thought shunted its way through Hugh's mind. Getting the newcomer to the Broken Drum so easily was a stroke of luck, no doubt of it, and Umor would probably reward him. But for all of his new acquaintance's mildness, there was something about him that made Hugh uneasy, and for the life of him, he couldn't figure out what it was. Not the two extra eyes, odd they were. There was something else. He glanced back. The little man was ambling along in the middle of the street, looking around him with an expression of keen interest. Something else, Hugh saw, made him gibber. The massive wooden chest, which he had last seen resting solidly on the quayside, was following on its master's heel with a gentle rocking gait. Slowly, in case a sudden movement on his part might break his fragile control over his own legs, Hugh bent slightly so that he could see under the chest. There were lots and lots of little legs. Very deliberately, Hugh turned around and walked very carefully toward the Broken Drum. "Odd," said Umor. "He has this big wooden chest," added Cripple Waugh. "He'd have to make a merchant or a spy," said Umor. He pulled a scrap of meat from the cutlet in his hand and tossed it into the air. It hadn't reached the zenith of its arc before a black shape detached itself from the shadow in the corner of the room and swooped down, taking the morsel in midair. "A merchant or a spy?" repeated Umor. "I'd prefer a spy. A spy pays for himself twice, because there's always the reward when we turn him in. What do you think, Withel?" Opposite Umor, the second greatest thief in Ankh-Morpork half closed one eye and shrugged. "I've checked on the ship," he said. "It's a freelance trader. Does the occasional run to the Brown Islands. People there are just savages. They don't understand about spies, and I expect they eat merchants." "He looked a bit like a merchant," offered Waugh, "except he wasn't fat." There was a flutter of wings at the window. Umor shifted his bulk out of the chair and crossed the room, coming back with a large raven. After he had unfastened the message capsule from its leg, it flew up to join its fellows lurking among the rafters. Withel regarded it without love. Umor's ravens were notoriously loyal to their master, to the extent that Withel's one attempt to promote himself to the rank of greatest thief in Ankh-Morpork had cost their master's right-hand man his left eye. But not his life, however. Umor never grudged a man at his ambitions. "B12, said Umor, tossing the file aside and unrolling the tiny scroll within. "Gorin the cat," said Withel. "On station, up in the gong tower at the Temple of the Small Gods." He says Hugh has taken our stranger to the Broken Drum. Well, that's good enough. Broadman is a friend of ours, isn't he?
Aye, said Withel, if he knows what's good for trade.
Among his customers has been your man Gorin, said Ymor pleasantly. For he writes here about box on legs. If I read this scrawl carefully and correctly. He looked at Withel over the top of the paper. Withel looked away.
He will be disciplined, he said flatly.
Waugh looked at the man leaning back in his chair, his black-clad frame resting on as nonchalantly as a rimland puma on a jungle branch, and decided that Gorin, atop small god's temple, would be soon joining those little deities in the multifold of dimensions of the beyond. And he owed Waugh 3 copper pieces. Ymor crumpled the note and tossed it into a corner. I think we'll wander along to the drum later. Withel, perhaps, too, we may try this beer that your men find so tempting. Withel said nothing. Being Ymor's right-hand man was like being gently flogged to death with scented bootlaces. The twin city of Ankh-Morpork, foremost among all the cities bounding the Circle Sea, was a matter, of course, the home of a large number of gangs, thieves' guilds, syndicates, and similar organizations. This was one of the reasons for its wealth. Most of the humbler folk on the Wittershan side of the river, in Morpork's mazy alleys, supplemented their meager incomes by filling some small role for one or other of the competing gangs. So it was that by the time Hugh and Two Flower entered the courtyard of the Broken Drum, the leaders of a number of them were aware that someone had arrived in the city who appeared to have much treasure. Some reports from the more observant spies included details about a book that told the stranger what to say and a box that walked by itself. These facts were immediately discounted. No magician capable of such enchantments ever came within a mile of Morpork docks. It still being that hour when most of the city was just rising or about to go to bed, there were a few people in the drum to watch Two Flower descend the stairs. When the luggage appeared behind him and started to lurch confidently down the steps, the customers at the wooden rough tables, as one man, looked suspiciously at their drinks. Broadman was browbeating the small troll who swept the bar when the trio walked past him.
What in hell's that?
He said. Just don't talk about it, hissed Hugh. Two Flower was already thumbing through his book.
What's he doing?
Said Broadman, arms akimbo. It tells him what to say. I know it sounds ridiculous, muttered Hugh.
How can a book tell a man what to say? I wish for an accommodation, a room, lodgings, the lodging house, full board. Are your rooms clean? A room with a view. What is your rate for one night? Said Two Flower in one breath.
Broadman looked at Hugh. The beggar shrugged. He's got plenty of money.
Tell him it's 3 copper pieces then, and that thing will have to go in the stable.
Huh? Said the stranger. Broadman held up 3 thick, red fingers, and the man's face was suddenly a sunny display of comprehension. He reached into his pouch and laid 3 large gold pieces in Broadman's palm. Broadman stared at them. They represented about 4 times the worth of the Broken Drum, staff included. He looked at Hugh. There was no help there. He looked at the stranger. He swallowed.
Yes,
he said, in an unnaturally high voice.
And then there's meals, of course. You understand, yes. Food? You eat? No?
He made the appropriate motions. Phut, said the little man.
Yes,
said Broadman, beginning to sweat.
Have a look in your little book. I should.
The man opened the book and ran a finger down the page. Broadman, who could read after a fashion, peered over the top of the volume. What he saw made no sense.
Food,
said the stranger. Yes, cutlish, hash, chop, stew, rage out, fricassee, minced, callops, souffle, dumpling, blank mange, sorbet, gruel, sausage, not to have a sausage, beans without a bean, kickshaws, jelly, jam, giblets. He beamed at Broadman.
All that?
Said the innkeeper weakly. It's just the way he talks, said Hugh. Don't ask me why, he just does. All eyes in the room were watching the stranger, except for a pair belonging to Rincewind the wizard, who was sitting in the darkest corner nursing a mug of very small beer. He was watching the luggage. Watch Rincewind. Look at him, scrawny like most wizards. and clad in a dark red robe on which a few mystic sigils were embroidered in tarnished sequins. This might have taken him for a mere apprenticed enchanter who had run away from his master out of defiance, boredom, fear, and a lingering taste for heterosexuality. Yet around his neck was a chain bearing the bronze octagon that marked him as an alumnus of Unseen University, the high school of magic whose time and space transcendent campus is never precisely here or there. Graduates were usually destined for mageship at least, but Rincewind, after an unfortunate event, had left knowing only one spell and made a living of sorts around the town by capitalizing on an innate gift of languages. He avoided work as a rule, but had a quickness of wit that put his acquaintances in mind of a bright rodent. And he knew sapient pearwood when he saw it. He was seeing it now, and didn't quite believe it. An archmage, by dint of great effort and much expenditure of time, might eventually obtain a small staff made from the timber of the sapient pear tree. It only grew on the sites of ancient magic. There were probably no more than 2 such staves in all the cities of the Circle Sea. A large chest of it, Rincewind tried to work it out, and decided that even if a box were crammed with star opals and sticks of aurichlorotum, the contents would not be worth 1/10 of the price of the container. A vein started to throb in his forehead. He stood up and made his way to the trio. "May I be of assistance?" he ventured.
"Shove off, Rincewind," snarled Broadman.
"I only thought it might be useful to address the gentleman in his own tongue," said the wizard gently.
"He's doing all right on his own,"
said the innkeeper, but took a few steps backward. Rincewind smiled politely at the stranger and tried a few words of Chimaran. He prided himself on his fluency in the tongue, but the stranger looked only bemused.
"It won't work," said Hugh knowledgeably. "It's the book, you see. It tells him what to say. Magic."
Rincewind switched to the High Borogavian. The Vanglamesh, Sumtri, even Black Urugu, the language with no nouns and only one adjective, which is obscene. Each was met with polite incomprehension. In desperation he tried heathen Trob, and the little man's face split into a delighted grin. "At last," he said. "My good sir, this is remarkable," although in Trob the last word in fact became "a thing which may happen but once in the usable lifetime of a canoe hollowed diligently by axe and fire from the tallest diamondwood tree that grows on the noted diamondwood forests on the lower slopes of Mount Iwakawa, home of the fire gods, or so it is said." "What was all that?" said Broadman suspiciously. "What did the innkeeper say?" said the little man. Rincewind swallowed. "Broadman," he said, 2 mugs of your best ale, please." "You can understand him?" "Oh, sure." Tell him he's very welcome. Tell him breakfast is a 1 gold piece." For a moment Broadman's face looked as though some vast internal struggle was going on, and then he added with a burst of generosity, "I'll throw in yours too." "Stranger," said Rincewind levelly, "if you stay here, you will be knifed or poisoned by nightfall. Do not stop smiling, or so will I." "Oh, come now," said the stranger, looking around. "This looks like a delightful place. A genuine Morporkian tavern. I've heard so much about them, you know. All these quaint old beams, and so reasonable, too." Rincewind glanced around quickly, in case some leakage of enchantment from the magician's quarter across the river had momentarily transported them to some other place. No, this was still the interior of the drum, its walls stained with smoke, its floor a compost of old rushes and nameless beetles, its sour beer not so much purchased as merely hired for a while. He tried to fit the image around the word quaint, or rather the nearest Trob equivalent, which was that pleasant oddity of design found in the little coral houses of the sponge-eating pygmies on the Orohai Peninsula. His mind reeled back from the effort. The visitor went on, "My name is Two-Flower," and extended his hand. Instinctively, the other 3 looked down to see if there was a coin in it. "Pleased to meet you," said Rincewind. "I'm Rincewind. Look, I wasn't joking. This is a tough place." "Good, exactly what I wanted." "Huh? What is this stuff in the mugs?" "This beer. Thanks, Broadman. Yes, beer, you know, beer." "Ah, so the so typical drink. A small gold piece will suffice payment, do you think? I do not want to cause offense." It was already half out of his purse.
"Yeah,"
croaked Rincewind. "I meant no, it won't cause offense. Good. You say this is a tough place? Frequented, you mean, by heroes and men of adventure?" Rincewind considered this. Yes, he managed. Excellent. I would like to meet some. An explanation occurred to the wizard. He said, you've come to hire mercenaries, warriors who will fight for the tribe with most milk-nut meal. Oh, no. I just want to meet them, so that when I get home I can say that I did. Rincewind thought that a meeting with most of the drum's clientele would mean that Two-Flower never went home again unless he lived downriver and happened to float past. Where is your home? He inquired. Broadman had slipped away into some back room, he noticed. Hugh was watching them suspiciously from a nearby table. Have you heard of the city of Bespelargic? Well, I didn't spend much time in Trob. I was just passing through, you know. Oh, it's not Trob. I speak Trob because there are many Trob sailors on our ports. Bespelargic is a major seaport on the Agadian Empire. Never heard of it, I'm afraid. Two-Flower raised his eyebrows. No, it's quite big. You sail turnwise from the Brown Islands for about a week, and there it is. Are you all right? He hurried around the table and patted the wizard on the back. Rincewind choked on his beer. The counterweight continent. 3 streets away, an old man dropped a coin into a saucer of acid and swirled it gently. Broadman waited impatiently, ill at ease in a room made noisome by vats and bubbling beakers and lined with shelves containing shadowy shapes suggestive of skulls and stuffed impossibilities. Well, he demanded.
One cannot hurry these things, said the old alchemist peevishly. Assaying takes time.
He prodded the saucer, where the large coin now lay in a swirl of green color. He made some calculations on a scrap of parchment.
Exceptionally interesting,
he said at last.
Is it genuine?
The old man pursed his lips.
It depends on how you define the term, he said. If you mean, is this coin the same as, say, a $50 piece, then the answer is no.
I knew it!
Screamed the innkeeper and started toward the door.
I'm not sure that I'm making myself clear, said the alchemist.
Broadman turned around angrily.
What do you mean?
Well, you see, what with one thing and another, our coinage has somewhat been watered over the years. The gold content of the average coin is barely 4 parts in 12, the balance being made up of silver, copper.
What of it?
I said this coin isn't like ours. It is pure gold.
After Broadman had left, at a run, the alchemist spent some time staring at the ceiling. Then he drew out a very small piece of thin parchment, rummaged for a pen amongst the debris of his workshop, and wrote a very short, small message. Then he went over to his cages of white doves, black cockerels, and other laboratory animals. From one cage he removed a glossy coated rat, rolled the parchment into the file, and attached it to a hind leg, then let the animal go. It sniffed around the floor for a moment, then disappeared down a hole in the far wall. At about this time, a hitherto unsuccessful fortune-teller living on the other side of the block chanced to glance into her scrying bowl, gave a small scream, and within the hour had sold her jewelry, various magical accoutrements, most of her clothes, and almost all of her other possessions that could be not conveniently carried on the fastest horse she could buy. The fact that later on, when her house collapsed in flames, she herself died in a freak landslide in the Moorpork Mountains, proves that death, too, has a sense of humor. Also about that moment, as the homing rat disappeared into the maze of runs under the city, scurrying along the faultless obedience to the ancient instinct, the patrician of Ankh-Morpork picked up the letters delivered that morning by the albatross. He looked pensively at the topmost one again and summoned his chief of spies. And in the broken drum, Rincewind was listening open-mouthed as Two-Flower talked. So you see, I decided to see for myself, said the little man. 8 years saving up this has cost me, but worth every half Rhinu. Here I am, in Ankh-Morpork, famed in story and song. In the streets that have known the tread of the Herrick Whiteblade, Hrun the Barbarian, and Brav the Hublander, and the Weasel. It's all just like I imagined, you know? Rincewind's face was a mask of fascinated horror. I couldn't just stand it any more back in Bespelargic. Two-Flower went on blithely. Sitting at a desk all day, just adding up columns of figures, just like a pension to look forward to at the end of it. Where's the romance in that? Two-Flower, I thought, it's now or never. You don't have to just listen to stories. You can go there. Now's the time to stop hanging around the docks listening to the sailors' tales. So I compiled a phrase book and bought passage on the next ship to the Brown Islands." "No guards?" murmured Rincewind. "No, why? What have I got worth selling?" Rincewind coughed. You have that gold," he said. "Barely 2,000 Rhinu, hardly enough to keep a man alive for more than a month or two. At home, that is. I imagine they might stretch a bit further here." "Would a Rhinu be one of those big gold coins?" said Rincewind. "Yes." Two-Flower looked worriedly at the wizard over the top of his strange seeing lenses. "Will 2,000 be sufficient, do you think?" "Oh, croaked Rincewind. "I mean, yes, sufficient." "Good." Is everyone in the Agedian Empire as rich as you?" "Agadian Empire as rich as you?" "Me? Rich? Bless you! Whatever put that idea into your head? I am but a poor clerk. Did I pay the innkeeper too much, do you think?" Rincewind conceded. He might have settled for less." "Ah, I should like to know better next time." "I shall know better next time. I can see I have a lot to learn. An idea occurs to me. Rincewind, would you perhaps consent to be employed as I don't know, perhaps the word guide would fit your circumstances. I think I could afford to pay you a Rhinu a day." Rincewind opened his mouth to reply, but felt the words huddle together in his throat, reluctant to emerge in a world that was rapidly going mad. Two-Flower blushed. "I have offended you," he said. "It was an impertinent request to make of such a professional man as yourself. Doubtless you have many projects you wish to return to, some works of magic, no doubt." "No," said Rincewind faintly. "Not just at present. A Rhinu, you say? One a day, every day?" "I think perhaps in the circumstances I should make it 1 1/2 Rhinu per day, plus any out-of-pocket expenses, of course." The wizard railed magnificently. "That will be fine," he said. "Great." Two-Flower reached into his pouch and took out a large round gold object, glanced at it for a moment, and slipped it back. Rincewind didn't get a chance to see it properly. "I think," said the tourist, "that I would like to rest a little now. It was a long crossing, and then perhaps you would care to call back around noon and we can take a look at the city." "Sure." "Then please be good enough to ask the innkeeper to show me to my room." Rincewind did so, and watched the nervous Broadman, who had arrived at a gallop from some back room, led the way up the wooden steps behind the bar. After a few seconds the luggage got up and pattered across the floor after them. Then the wizard looked down at the 6 big coins in his hand. Two-Flower had insisted on paying his first 4 days' wages in advance. Hugh nodded and smiled encouragingly. Rincewind snarled at him. As a student wizard, Rincewind had never achieved high enough marks in precognition. But now unused circuits in his brain were throbbing, and the future might as well have been engraved in bright colors on his eyeballs. The space between his shoulder blades began to itch. The sensible thing to do, he knew, was to buy a horse. It would have to be a fast one, and expensive. Offhand, Rincewind couldn't think of any horse dealer he knew who was rich enough to give change out of almost a whole ounce of gold. And then, of course, the other 5 coins would help him set up a useful practice at some safe distance away, say 200 miles. That would be the most sensible thing. But what would happen to Two-Flower, all alone in the city where even the cockroaches had an unerring interest for gold? A man would have to be a real heel to leave him. I'm going to break here. These chapters seem to go and go and go. Back soon.